Yes, I'd like to say several words about the relationship between frequency and structure, things which have been really the focus of my study in the last years. And well, I've been mainly investigating this topic from the perspective of phonotactics, so consonant clusters in various languages, and I'm going to sort of present an overview of things which I have worked on. Starting with, of course, the syllable and the complexity of the syllable. So basically, here in this map, you can see the overview of complex syllables across the languages of the world, and the red spots correspond to complex syllables. So basically, for example, onsets, which are composed of 3 up to 4 consonants. Rather unusual, as we know that the vast majority of world languages prefer consonant clusters. But the interesting thing is, as you can see, that when you think about European languages, so Slavic and Germanic languages, which is the focus of my study, basically most of them are complex. But what does this complexity refer to? So let's have a look. Here you have German and English, which are classified as complex, and you can see that most of classes in these languages, the onsets, of course, they are doubles, and there are only several 3-member clusters, ranging from 50 to 60, depending on the account. And then when you compare it to Slavic languages, in which we have, for example, 460 classes, like in Polish, which is also classified as complex. So something does not work properly here, right? I'm not listing Russian. Russian is very similar to Polish. It just has, you know, fewer classes, but also, you know, almost 400. So as you can see, the complexity, you know, varies depending on cluster size, yeah, so from 2 or 3 consonants in a row up till 5. So as you can see in Polish, the strfie, strfiąż, it's actually it's quite pathological, even for me as a native speaker, but it's there, right? So it's there, and also as you can see, the number of cluster types, so and morphological complexity, which is also present here in Polish. So there are several diagnostics of complexity, which have been listed in the literature, but I'll focus mainly on these 2. So violation of universals. So basically universal 1 of Greenberg, that's cluster length, so size, and universal 3, basically the compositionality of classes. We should be able to decompose them into constituent parts. And also phonological principles such as the sonority sequencing generalization, which has been traditionally used in the study of phonotactics. And then what about frequency here? Well, let's have a look. Okay, so just a brief overview. I think we're all familiar with the sonority sequencing generalization, but just to remind us maybe what it predicts, namely the rising sonority slope in onset and falling sonority slope in coda position. Basically, as you can see here, we have a 7-member scale, which has been very frequently used in the study of languages across the world, also Polish, but that's the one taken from Goldsmith. But then when you look at the literature, which is really vast, actually there are almost as many scales as authors, right? So ranging from really 3 classes to 16 classes, yeah? So for example, in some scales, plosives, affricates, and fricatives are lumped into a single class of obstruents, or there are further distinctions are made into voiced and voiceless, etc. And the same holds true for vowels and liquids, etc. Yeah, so actually the most complex scale that we have in the literature is by Parker, I think, where we have 16 categories here. Okay, so again, this is a problem. What type of scale should we use in talking about complexity? I mean, then depending on the scale, you get different results. Yeah, so using the 7-point scale, there are instances here from Polish, German, and English. So please compare well-formed classes. So classes which follow the sonority hierarchy constitute 45% of this large list, while in German and in English, well, the number is larger. Yeah, so basically, we would say that German and English are well-formed or better formed than Polish classes in Polish. In Russian, the proportions are yet different when you compare Polish to Russian. So Russian is even worse, although there's fewer clusters. And basically, in the Slavic languages, we have a problem of, all these plateau clusters and a lot of sonority violating clusters, which are, many of which are unpronounceable even for native speakers, right? So what do we do about it? Well, obviously, we have a look. Obviously, sonority is not the best measure, and we all know, I mean, that's why so many sonority scales have been posited for various languages, right? So if you take, for example, a 5-point scale for Polish, where obstruents are lumped into one class, I mean, suddenly the result largely improves. So we're really at a loss, really, phonotacticians are at a loss what measure to use. So that's why I propose not to use sonority, but to decompose sonority into constituent parts, and just to see really not what the structure should be like, but what it is like. So we just forget the whole idea of what the syllable should be shaped like, and we really look into what's in the cluster. I think we really get a much better picture really of phonotactic complexity, especially cross-linguistically. Okay, so this idea has been elaborated on in my previous work, also with collaborators, but it gets good support from various research, also psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic research, when we know, for example, that the same set of stimuli are processed differently by Polish brains and German brains. How possible? I mean, yes, it's possible, but yet it's surprising, and it makes us think what other factors come into play. So what we found, for example, in Polish, a language which has never been really associated with any specific place constraints, that place of articulation distances, so basically how front or how back the tongue is in articulation, these factors are critical for perception and for processing or for response latencies. Okay, so basically, as regards structure and usage, just two words about this relationship. We know that there are two main philosophies, and one states basically evaluates clusters on the basis of sonority and sonority principle, or related principles like sonority distance, for example, while there is also another view which is strictly related to frequency, claiming that frequent structures should be preferred, well-formed, however you name it. Okay, so the question is, what is really the relationship between these two things? Yeah, so structure and frequency. Okay, so the goal of the several analyses I'll report on is to examine the relationship between structure and usage, and also to find, if possible, parameters which are responsible for cluster complexity and which can be related to frequency, which are not necessarily related to sonority. And the languages which I'll report on are Polish, Russian, German, and English. So two Slavic, two Germanic. I think the ordering which is presented here reflects the degree of complexity on various levels. It's really difficult to measure this complexity, but that's kind of intuitive, my intuitive proposal, also based on the data that we have seen. Okay, so the data which was extracted for these studies were taken from various course books, handbooks, dictionaries, corpora, so cluster inventories, but also type and token frequencies. So the data goes into millions. And basically, the first step of the analysis was to determine what type of features or parameters or properties of clusters are important, in each of these languages. Okay, so as I said, instead of using sonority as a measure, I decomposed sonority into 26 constituents. As you can see, we have complexity, place of articulation, manner of articulation, and voicing. Complexity, these are mainly universal, so size and compositionality, but also identity avoidance, which corresponds to OCP. So basically, we don't want the same identical segments neighboring on each other. Place features, various place features, cluster initially, cluster finally, number of labials, dorsals, coronals, etc. Many features, all kinds, referring to stridency, continuity, and parameter 14 marked green. This is articulatory opening. This is the traditional measure of sonority. So how sonority is included in the analysis. Yeah? So basically how we would analyze clusters using the sonority scale, which I presented. And voicing, yeah? So voicing of initial consonant, voicing of final consonant, and the cluster, voice agreement, etc. Okay, so all these 26 parameters were used to describe clusters, and I'll just show you on the example of two dimensions of complexity and voicing, how it was done in English, and then I'll present the summary of the results for all the languages. So for example, imagine that in English, cluster size is the following. We have doubles and triples, 2-member, 3-member clusters. So there are 49 2-member clusters and 9 3-member clusters, which translates into 84 and 16%. So basically these percentages for each parameter and each cluster were translated into percentage scores. So basically all the clusters, which are CC clusters, get a score of 0.84, while all the 3-member clusters get a score of 0.16. So this was done for all the clusters and all parameters. Yeah? In case, for example, of parameters 2 and 3, compositionality and identity avoidance, where all the classes are compositional, so they consist of existent smaller subunits, and they avoid identity, basically the repetition of the same segment, then all these classes would get the value equal 1. Okay, that's 100%. Okay, so in general, all these percentages and percentage scores were calculated for each cluster, as I said. And this is generally what we can see. For example, here is just a percentage-based ranking for English, again, for English onsets. You can see the rank, which is based on the percentages, then the dimension, so which aspect of phonology is critical for English onsets, and a particular pattern which was found. So for example, we can see that absolute requirements for clusters are given in the first part of the table, so labeled 100%. So in all the clusters, all classes are can be decomposed, have total identity avoidance, they don't have strident consonant finally, they have a consonantal cluster, consonant cluster initially, etc. Yeah? And then, you know, there are some strong defaults and weak defaults presented here, so we can see that these preferences are followed, you know, by the majority of clusters in English. But this is not very telling. This is just statistics. This is just, you know, descriptive statistics. We want to know statistically what the truth is. So for this purpose, I used a principal component analysis, which is actually a very good measure for this type of study, because it transforms all these 26 variables into components, and it lets us see really which of the variables are the most important ones for the discrimination of the data. So we can actually see the underlying structure of clusters, so to say. So this is a scree plot, again, only for English onsets. We can see only 10 components, the initial 10 components, but generally the PCA is created in a way to maximize the importance of the first component. So basically the first component explains the largest variability in the data. Yeah? So here, as you can see, component 1 explains 31% of the data, which maybe doesn't seem to be very much, but then again, in combination with component 2, that's already half of the data that we have. And it's quite a lot given this type of analysis in phonotactics. Okay, so that's why I will report the data for the first 2 components, yeah, only. Okay, and this is it, again, English onset. So what we can see is that, and this is actually the ranking of the most important variables, which contribute most to structure and explain the variability in the data. So as you can see, mainly these are manner of articulation features which are important here. So the presence of a sonorant cluster finally, so just before a vowel, a voiced consonant cluster finally, so again before a vowel, increased articulatory opening, that's sonority, one obstruent in CC. So again, if we have one obstruent in CC and sonorant cluster finally, then obviously, as you can see, you know, the preferred structure is obstruent plus sonorant plus vowel, yeah? Which is a beautiful cluster cross-linguistically. Yeah? And then component 2, we have similar variables listed. Okay, so now when we compare the results across the languages, we can see that in English and in German we get quite similar results. So what's important for phonotactics in the two languages, in English and in German? Well, mainly voicing and manner of articulation features, and also size. So basically everything that contributes to sonority. Yeah, fine. I mean, most of studies in the world have been done on, sonority has been examined on English, so this is not really surprising. But the surprising thing is, in Polish and Russian, I mean, we get different variables. In Polish, for example, we have place of articulation, that's point number 1. As you can see, rank 1, place, non-strident consonant cluster finally. So suddenly a place of articulation comes into play, which probably we would not really expect. Okay, we also have voicing, we have manner of articulation, complexity, but generally this shows us that sonority is not really a reliable measure because it just doesn't include place as a feature in the scale. Yeah? And that's why maybe it cannot really explain, provide a good account of complexity of classes in some languages. Okay, and now analysis 2 is goes specifically into the structure based on these properties and frequency. So the question is, can frequency be estimated from these phonetic and phonological parameters? So I did this on 2 languages, just German and Polish, to compare 2 language families. So there were 4 types of frequencies here, type and tokens, raw frequencies, and logarithmic frequencies. And independent variables, this was not the whole list of 26 variables. It would be really difficult to create a regression model with 26 variables. So I selected 13, which were sort of reappeared in all the accounts. Okay, and basically, what's the result here? And again, these are just onsets in German. Yeah? So we can see that a full model was not really useful, only reduced models. So whenever we reduced variables to actually only several. As you can see, surprise, surprise, the majority of these variables do not contribute to frequency. Like when you look at logarithmic token frequency, this is top left picture, here the manner of articulation distance and voice agreement play a role. What is manner of articulation distance? Well, these are basically sonority distances, so not sonority profile, but distances which play a role. So average frequency values are higher for larger distances, and also voice agreement plays a role in for frequency. And when you look at the bottom picture of logarithmic type frequencies, here we get very similar results. Yeah? So types and tokens correspond to each other. Yeah? So these are many distances and voicing which play a role. Okay, so there are some borderline cases which you can see with coronality and dorsality, labiality, which are also important here. But there's too little time to elaborate on it, I think. Okay, and now maybe I can skip this. I think there is no time.
Yeah, actually, you will do the chat with 1 minute.
Okay, yes, really, this is just 1 minute. And now let's compare Polish. Please have a look. We also have the data for onset classes and manner of articulation and size, which play a role. Yeah. So, so again, what's surprising here? Well, there's not sonority profile, not sonority sequencing generalization, but distances. Okay, and the results are sort of comparable to what we got in German. Okay, so how to conclude? Basically, what we can see, also from slides which I did not manage to present, is that there is no one-to-one correspondence, yeah, between structure and frequency. And they constitute 2 separate domains. Yeah, so we cannot really my feeling, relate one to the other very strongly. Yeah, there is no simple path from structure to usage and vice versa. Yeah, and okay, just 1 minute, maybe I just skip it. So the general conclusion is, well, maybe we should reconsider using different measures in phonotactics and actually think about maybe moving away from sonority profile to sonority distances, mana distances, and other properties which can play a role, which we can only find when we do kind of largely experimental work and not use, you know, a priori models which have been on the market for quite a while. Okay, thank you very much. I think I need to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you have questions, you can raise your virtual hand or send them in the Q&A. Sorry, the Q&A feature. While people are collecting their thoughts, just to make sure, I felt like ultimately you would want to find things that are similar between these languages, right?
Yes.
So you were saying in the last slide to kind of move away from sonority, going to experimental find, but like, how do you vision that? Like, what would that coalesce into? Or
yeah,
I know.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to make big claims on typology because there's just 4 languages, but somehow, you know, somehow related, but still different. Yeah, Germanic, Slavic. Okay. So obviously I've seen this also in other languages, in Dutch and in Afrikaans, that sonority does play a role, and we can account for a number of phenomena in phonology using sonority. Yeah? But still in other languages, Slavic languages, it's just, we can't do it. And we end up with these, you know, incorrect claims that these languages have no rules and that classes are pathological and basically that anything goes. No, it's not true that anything goes. There are just different constraints which come into play. Yeah? So as you can see, place constraints. We know that the processing of, for instance, Polish involves consulting place of articulation rather than manner. Yeah, so yeah, this really is a large scale set of studies which would really investigate all these properties. Yeah, like continuance, like stridency. I mean, all these features we know they're important. For example, for production, in reducing consonant clusters, we look at continuous feature, the continuously. So really it's a large scale project, and yeah, maybe one day we'll know, but certainly we should not have such a simple way of thinking about phonotactics of languages just through certain measures which have been proposed 100 years ago.